Hello. As you may know, I'm an industry futurist focusing on how the airport and airline sectors can navigate the uncertainty that we're currently in and that might shape the next decade. And in this session, I really want to share with you some of the work we've been doing and the thinking we've been doing about the future of the sector. As we know, we're surrounded by forecasts of passenger numbers, profitability, revenues, and the risks to airlines and airports around their future viability. And they're coming every day, and they are very scary. But at the same time, we also know there's incredible innovation still happening in terms of developments such as hypersonic flight, pod aircraft, vertical airports, all sorts of innovation ideas that are still on the agenda. So we have to try and navigate the two. And what we have been doing with Future Travel Experience is a whole study around Air Transport 2035. Early on this year, at the start of the pandemic, we did a study looking at the impacts of the coronavirus on the sector. We then went on to look at what it might mean for innovation and digital transformation. And a lot of the ideas and thoughts that came into those studies are playing out right now. If you haven't already got a copy, you can get it from our website. If you're an airline or an airport, just email me and you can have it for free. But now looking beyond that, where do we go next? Well, we know there are a number of critical forces at play here that could shape the broader economic environment and the future for the sector. And how we can make sense of that is by developing some scenarios. And I want to think about three different scenarios, and I want you to think about what would we do under any of these scenarios. I think most of us are still favoring the most optimistic scenario. A lot of people talk to me and say, yes, we're doing work on the others, but really they're not doing as much as on the most optimistic one. So our challenge is to say, if you knew that any of these scenarios were going to happen, what would you do? The first is what we're calling unknown territory, because it truly is. Although we've got the excitement of the vaccines coming through, and the first one has now been licensed for the UK, we also know that it could be that it might take 5 years to get everyone across the planet vaccinated. And the virus travels across the world in seat 43C of an aircraft. People carry it. And so until we've pretty much vaccinated the bulk of the population across the planet, we haven't eradicated it. And so under this scenario, it takes a long time to build those health infrastructures, those distribution infrastructures to really get effective vaccination across the planet. And at the same time, we would also see a very deep and prolonged economic downturn. We already heard the UK saying that it might take till 2024 to 2025 to get to some stability. And some are saying we might never get back to the kind of economic growth predictions we were talking about at the start of 2020. We've seen other countries like India saying this could last 5 years. Other countries may be shorter because they have managed the pandemic better. We'll see an uneven response, but across the globe, in this scenario, we see a really bad economic impact long term. The second scenario is where many think we are now, where countries are effectively going in and out of different types of stay-at-home or lockdown measures. The recovery is choppy. Some people are doing very well. Some countries are doing well, others less well. But hopefully in this scenario, the hope is that you would have the pandemic effectively eradicated by 2023 with vaccination across the globe, and recovery really starting to happen by the end of 2021 economically. In the final scenario, which we call hope and renewal, this is one where we really outstrip expectations and have the infrastructure in place to deliver as full a vaccination program as possible across the planet by the end of 2022. We see economic growth happening as a result of governments really putting a strong focus on job creation and retraining people for the industries of the future, strong investment in those industries, particularly the green new sectors, and incentives to encourage existing businesses to invest and grow our way out of the downturn. And hopefully by 2022, we're really starting to see an uptick across most economies across the planet. So again, what I'd say is, thinking about those three different scenarios, what would your plan be under any scenario? And what can we do about this? Well, I think the first thing we need to think about is how we reframe our approach to strategy. And we need to think about 3 different time horizons now. Firstly, what we need to be doing in any 3-month window, just to make sure that we're viable as an organization. Secondly, we need to be thinking about the year ahead because it's so uncertain. What are our plans to do things differently as the game changes? What are the new rules of the game in aviation? And how do we adapt to that with product and process innovation? And finally, we need to be thinking about that longer term. We need to be looking at what might impact the sector over the 1 to 10 year time frame, develop some scenarios for how those things might come together, and then make sure we're doing the rethinking of strategies, of business models, of capabilities to get there. And then that drives back into what we need to be doing over the next year in terms of investing in capability, mindset, and capacity for innovation so that we can respond to anything in the longer term. Secondly, we really need to get our heads around where are the big pain points in our organization. With every organization we work with, there are 3 common ones. One is too many initiatives and an unwillingness to prioritize and rationalize the agenda. Secondly, not getting our hands around our technology and getting the core sorted. The core has to be a single source of data, a single view of the truth, and then a very clear architecture for our technology, which includes who we might partner with to deliver it. And finally, around the capabilities we need to both get the most out of the current technology and what we're building, but also the broader capabilities to help us navigate through the uncertainty of the future. We know that that's being complicated and enhanced by a whole range of developments in science and technology that are moving at an exponential pace, whether that's Hyperloop, whether that's synthetic biology that might help us deal with climate change issues. But we also know at the same time that globally supply chains are shrinking, and these exponential technologies are allowing countries and companies to manufacture more at home, which is going to have an impact both on freight transport, but also the level of individual travel around the world. And we know that we're in an environment where perhaps the critical technology is digital. We know that 9 of the top 10 companies on the planet are digital players. And we saw that last year, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon all crossed the $1 trillion threshold in terms of valuation. This year, we've seen Apple go over $2 trillion. Now, to put $1 trillion into perspective, if you add together the valuations of all these companies, you still don't get to one Amazon, which is incredible. And what we see is this is really telling us a story about how deep digital is penetrating society, how far it might go, and how these players are increasingly going to become participants in sectors, investors in sectors, co-developers of the next model for the sectors. So they will be bringing transformational ideas to the sector. We also know that amongst these, artificial intelligence really could be the dominant technology. We're seeing an accelerated pace of development as a result of the downturn. We're seeing the sector now starting to embrace and experiment with it. And you're seeing a lot of discussion of that in this conference. And we're seeing countries like China investing $430 billion to get global leadership in the AI field. So we know it's going to be increasingly central. The faster we can learn about it, get our heads around it, and really start to see the potential it gives us, the faster we can build a new operating model, a new cost model, and a new service delivery model for our organizations. One of the challenges I think we all face is that although we want to do some incredibly smart things with technology, with infrastructure, most of us are really challenged by the losses faced during the pandemic and the uncertain forecasts for the future. And I think what this drives us towards is forming small collaborations between a few airlines or a few airports to develop these technologies together, to develop these solutions together. Maybe we're talking about taking a rapid construction approach. And we can either share resources in a very loose way, we can have each member of the consortium developing different applications and then sharing them, or we can pull resources together from different organizations to work together in a lab to create solutions that we can then roll out to all the partners. That hopefully gives us an accelerated development path. It gives us a lower cost of development, but it also creates tools that we can maybe sell to other players in the sector to help recoup some of our investment and create alternative revenue streams. We know we have to prepare for uncertain traffic levels. And although we're going to see a bounce back and people going back to the office and starting to travel, and certainly leisure travelers taking more trips in the coming years, in the business world, I think technology is going to change the agenda a little bit. We will see a continued level of virtual participation, even though there will still be some live events. We'll see people now recognizing that they don't have to travel as much for a lot of their meetings, internally or externally. So we have to start baking into our plans the idea that the business travel market may not recover for 4 or 5 years until there's a growth in demand driven by the new sectors coming through. We also know that every sector is starting to rethink its strategy, its business model for the world we're moving into. Let me give you an example from another sector. This is a company called Earthbuy from Italy. It's a startup that's creating 100% biodegradable plastic. And what's really interesting is the strategy and business model. The entire way they operate, everything they do has been designed in collaboration with players from academia who are at the forefront of thinking. So they're really applying the best ideas. Secondly, they're using blockchain across all their operations to give them total transparency, total visibility, so that their customers have that reliability, have that assurance that the product does what it says it does and has been manufactured in the way it should be. And finally, they're using new crypto financing tokens, both to raise money, but also for customers to buy goods and services from them at a discount. The really interesting thing is how this business was founded. They started with 3 principles: sustainability, responsibility, and transparency. And everything else was built on top of that. And I think we're going to see these ideas coming into our business, which starts to raise the question as we look at long-term strategy, which is, if you were starting again in our organization, what would you do differently? And that starts to lay out the ideas about how we transition from the chaos today around the world to a model that's viable, sustainable, and profitable in the longer term. We also know that we're going to be challenged. We're going to be challenged for revenue streams. And I think this is where we start to think about, well, what are the new models for how we can use our assets differently, how we can bring new activities into our airports in particular, whether that's people doing temporary storage on spare space in the airport, people growing bio crops, vertical farming on the airport, particularly in times when we're not using as much of the space on runways or not using as many of the runways. How do we use every ounce of space to create new revenue streams? And really starting to think differently and be open to new ideas. And when we're open to new ideas and we're opening up to the marketplace bringing us ideas, that also opens us up to new revenue streams and new investment streams, because partners can then come to us with ideas about what they can create with our facilities, with our resources, and new ways of funding those, whether it's joint ventures, whether it's different forms of investment, but really opening ourselves up to ideas for how we transform and navigate the uncertainty of the next few years. I think everyone is fully aware now of the sustainability agenda and how important it's becoming. We've heard the UN now in its latest announcements really emphasizing that there's no vaccine for the global environmental crisis. We have to take this on ourselves. We know 2050 is the target. I think increasingly we all know in our hearts that we have to act much faster. We're seeing countries and cities already setting targets of 2025 or 2030 for getting to net zero on emissions, whether that's just through the actions of actually reducing emissions or through some additional mechanisms like offsets. We're seeing a number of corporations also starting to make those commitments. And what that tells us is that a lot more will follow. And in this period, I think over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see a lot of people moving there. So our belief is that by 2030, pretty much all of the mainstream auto manufacturers will largely have got out of manufacturing carbon fuel-based cars. You'll still see some specialists and maybe some markets will demand it. So that actually the players in the sector will change the agenda quickly. So that really raises the question for us of how can we move to net zero, not just on carbon, but on waste, on the generation of electricity and our emissions. And I think this is going to become an increasingly big part of the agenda. And I think we'll see some players coming through with targets now around somewhere between 2030 and 2040 for achieving those goals in a true manner. We also know we're in a world now of peak conspiracy or exponential growth in conspiracy theories. And I love this chart where this lady has taken all the different conspiracies and sort of categorized them. And I think as a sector, we're already victim to some conspiracy theories. But in the world going ahead, we know that we're likely to be subject to even more. And so the challenge is, how are we going to deal with those conspiracy theories as they come up or that could emerge? How do we start to factor that in? Because they can be so damaging to an organization. That then leads us to saying, well, how do we start to scan? What are we doing to scan the horizon to make sure we're understanding the kind of developments that might come our way, regularly developing scenario plans, building roadmaps of where we think we might try and get to in the coming years, and then using that to embed stronger and stronger resilience in our organization as we prepare for a range of possibilities. It also means really investing in our capability and getting people to take more responsibility for their own learning, their skills, and their digital literacy. And the great thing is there are an incredible array of free resources, short videos, and longer training courses that people can take now via the internet to really enable them to grow. So whether they stay in the organization or leave, they're building the kind of capabilities that can ensure their own personal viability. So it really leaves us with a challenge now. We knew familiar dance routines in terms of how we dealt with different things: an upturn in the market, a downturn in the market, emergence of a new competitor, opening up of a new route. We knew how we would deal with all those. Now everything is happening together and we're in a hugely uncertain world. So we have to be comfortable with getting on the dance floor, trying new routines, looking a bit awkward as some things work, some things don't. But until we get onto that dance floor and start experimenting, we're not going to get ourselves to the future. So I hope this has made sense. I hope it's given you some food for thought and really allowed you to think beyond just the next few months to how do we ensure our long-term viability. And just as a little support to help you, we have a newsletter that provides a regular flow of ideas and information about the emerging future. If you take a picture of the screen, you can go to our website, use that code RTNews, and sign up for a free 1-year subscription. And with that, I wish you an enjoyable rest of the conference and a very successful future. And now I'll hand back to Daniel. Thank you.